Well, of course, you say, how do you explain to people? I guess it depends on who the people are and how rational they are. But I can give you an explanation in terms of reasons. I can't recommend to you how to get people to. By the way, just as a footnote, your goal should never be to get people to agree with you. That's not a goal. And to feel that if the other guy doesn't agree, you failed. Your goal is to give reasons. If the other guy gives reasons, counter reasons, then you have to take them seriously and think about them, and you have to investigate to see which reasons are better. The other person listens to your reasons and says, I don't agree. On to the next. There are lots of people out there who don't want to be reasonable. There's nothing to do for them. My counsel is go on to somebody else who might want to be reasonable. So don't ever set yourself the goal of convincing him. The goal is to give reasons that are adequate and see whether he has counter reasons. If he has counter reasons, have a good discussion. If he doesn't listen to reason, go on to the next person. That's my counsel. At any rate, so how do you explain it to him? I don't know, but I can explain it. First thing is to try to discard the Western prejudice that the intellect is more important than anything else, and if you're really smart, you're better than everybody else, and if you have intellectual achievement, you have some kind of status above everybody else, which, by the way, a great deal of the common public doesn't share. A lot of the common public thinks that entertainment figures are much more successful than professors. Professors make nothing. Indeed, we had a fellow here in the yeshiva about 10 years ago. When the Soviet Union broke up, he, like a lot of clever people, got into stealing precious metals and selling them on the black market and radioactive materials. A couple of years he made a couple of $1 million. And then one of his friends cheated him out of it. And he told me that we had to, when we were selling this stuff in the black market, we had to have it certified that it was genuine and pure. How do you certify it? You go to Harvard University and you hire a chemist and you pay the bum $300 an hour. Could you imagine someone working for $300 an hour? What a bum. You know, what a piece of trash. You pay him to go through it and certify that it's pure, and then you sell it for $500,000 or $750,000. And his attitude to his professors was such contempt. Okay, but especially in Jewish circles, you know, you don't talk about my son, the bus driver. You talk about my son, the economist, or my son, the doctor. That's just a prejudice. That's just a prejudice. From the Jewish point of view, that has no purchase whatsoever. My business in the world is to serve God. And God determines how he shall be served, not my imagination and not my religious sensitivity and not my religious creativity. That's all if it's a fantasy. If you make up the fantasy, you can make it up any way you want. But if you're interacting with the reality, you can't fantasize what the table is and you can't fantasize what God is. God is what he is. And he says he wants to be served in a particular way. So if he wants to be served with the mind, as he does, that's one type of service. He wants to be served with the body, served with the bank account, served with the emotions. He wants to be served in all of the ways. I have to have no prejudices, no prejudgments about how I'm going to serve God and what it means in terms of my status. My job is to serve God. I have to look and see how he wants to be served. That's number one. Number two, there are areas of Jewish study which are every bit as difficult, challenging as Talmud, and which are open for women. And indeed, some of them are expected to be fluent in and to try to master like anyone else. Take the laws of Shabbos. Take the laws of kashrus. Take the laws of ribis, of interest-bearing loans. Women are perfectly competent to conduct business just as men are. And women are obligated in all the laws of business just as men are. And not taking and paying interest is one of the biblical laws about business. I saw a book this thick, full of mathematical calculations. If you give it this for time, depending on the weather, next year, the stock market, and so on, put it away in an interest-bearing account in 17 years. And how do you pay how do you take miser for charity and so forth and so on? There's no limitation on the challenge to a woman's intellect. Indeed, many men would be quite challenged to work on that, those types of studies. In the last 150 years, women's studies have branched out even to, let's say, Tanakh, the book of Isaiah, which is standardly studied in women's seminaries, with the major commentaries. I challenge you, you men who have this superiority complex, sit down with the book of Isaiah and sit down with the major commentaries and study it and see whether it's just a snap. Because women are studying it, so it must be just a pushover. Try it. I did it for a year, and I can testify to you. Isaiah especially is full of very, very abstruse poetry. The words are very, very poetical. Commentators struggle and have a variety of views on how to analyze it. You can sit there and work with the verses, work with the commentaries. You'll be challenged intellectually without any doubt. So that's simply not part of the explanation. The Talmud is a book that is very difficult to get a relationship with because it's written in an extremely inaccessible style. First of all, it's two languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. Second of all, there's no punctuation. No punctuation. That means no question marks and no commas and no periods. You have to parse it on your own. Third of all, it's written extremely briefly. If you want an analogy, imagine someone put microphones, recording devices in the Supreme Court building and recorded the Supreme Court justices when they're arguing with each other, fighting with each other. Now imagine you got a verbatim transcript. How much would you understand? None. This is a misdemeanor. Yeah, but it was in Ohio in the 1890s. So why is Ohio different from any place else? What is a misdemeanor? How is it different from a felony? You don't have a clue, and I don't have a clue. It's all technical talk. So the Talmud just doesn't read. If you look at it in the original, it just doesn't read. It takes years to just become literate in Talmud. Then the question of analyzing the reasoning and the comparisons to other passages and the rest, it takes years to become simply competent to read. Now, the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, the commandment of studying Torah, for a man is blanket across the board. As a mitzvah to study Torah, all of it. For a woman, it has two tiers. There's applicable halacha that Torah that is applied to life in practical terms, and that she's obligated to learn as well. And then there's Talmud, which is something which a woman is invited to learn, and if she learns it, she gets a reward for it, but she's not obligated. That's the biblical commandment. Now, I would suggest to you a little piece of theology. God is not in the habit of shooting himself in the foot. If God invites women to learn this, and God tells them that they'll be rewarded for it, they must be capable of it. There cannot be a situation where God says, I invite you to do this, and I'm offering you a reward for it, but guess what? You can't do it because I made you incapable to do it. That's not our picture of God. Maybe there are other religions like that. It doesn't fit our religion. So if he invites them to do it and offers them a reward, they must be capable of doing it. But it's not obligatory. Now, in the Jewish religion, there are two types of commandments. Obligatory, you must do it. I command you to do it. If you do it, you get rewarded. If you don't do it, you get punished. And voluntary mitzvos, I invite you to do it. If you do it, you'll be rewarded. If you don't, no penalty. In Torah, the obligatory mitzvahs are more important. They're more important than the voluntary. That's surprising to many people, especially if you don't have Jewish background. I can explain that if you like, but that's an axiom. And Maimonides, in codifying this law, makes that statement about that rule. So, if you are a woman, you're a religious woman, and your goal in life is to serve God, not to win points in Los Angeles, not to make it into the New York Society pages, but to serve God, you ask, well, what does God want of me? God wants me to know the Torah that I have to use to live. And God has invited me, but not commanded me, to learn the rest. Well, if he's invited me and not commanded me, it's secondary. It's secondary. It's peripheral. Now let's look at this study. It takes 4 years to become literate. Do I want to spend 4 years on a project that's peripheral? That's secondary? I don't think that's smart. I don't think that's responsible in Jewish terms, in serving God. That's why women typically don't invest in this. Because they're spiritually too sensitive to to invest a great deal of time and effort in something which is spiritually peripheral. There always have been exceptions, rare exceptions. You don't create institutions for exceptions. You create institutions, your message you're making to the public is not an exception, it's a norm. And it isn't a norm, it's only an exception. That's why there aren't any institutions for this. But other than that, that's why the preference is that women themselves have not to invest in Talmud study. It has no implications as to their intelligence, there's no implications as to their relative importance. God wants different things from different people. I am not less than a Kohen because I have less mitzvahs than a Kohen. I'm no less than a Kohen, one whit, one jot. God has more mitzvahs for them and less mitzvahs for me. My job is to spend my life performing the mitzvahs that apply to me. Same thing is true for women and men. Same thing is true across the board. And by the way, I'm taking all of this from Rabbi Eiselman's book, Rabbi Eiselman's classic Jewish Woman and Jewish Law, which is continuously in print for 45 years, and it's a classic on questions of women's status in Judaism. It's an absolute fundamental work, foundational work. A person who hasn't read that book has no right to an opinion on this subject. Yes, I'm against the idea that everyone has a right to an opinion. No, you have to earn a right to an opinion. If you're an ignoramus of the subject, you don't have a right to an opinion. If you have an opinion on a subject about which you're ignorant, then not only are you asserting a right you don't have, but you're not reasonable. You're not reasonable. And you wouldn't do it anywhere else. Only religion does this happen. Somebody says something about India, and you ask them, have you been there? Have you studied India? Have you read books about India? Well, I have a right to an opinion. You'll shoot him down right away. You haven't been there? You haven't read books about it? Then you don't have a right to an opinion. Only religion is different. Religion, you could be a blank ignoramus and you have a right to opinions about everything. It's not true. It's simply not true. Not true and it's not reasonable. So that's that. And then there's another book called A Woman in Jewish Law and Tradition, written by Michael Kaufman, which is based on Eiselman's book, but much more extensive. He has a history of feminism and the various strands of feminism, history of the status of women, going back to 2,000 years, to the Greeks, and then to the Roman and to the Christian period. So he took Eiselman's skeleton and he built a great deal out from it, and it's a very, very useful book. So if you want to read about this subject, those are the two books that I would recommend. Okay. On to the next. Yeah.
Just mentioned the right to an opinion. What exactly, how much must one learn before you begin to have a right to an opinion?
I don't know if I could give a precise answer to that. I'll just tell you, when I taught at Johns Hopkins, sometimes I would teach the Einstein-Bohr debates about quantum mechanics. Einstein said this and Bohr said that, back and forth. Inevitably, the students would say, so who's right? And I would say, who are you asking? You're asking me? Who's right? Einstein and Bohr? I just hope to enrich my life a little bit by studying some of the things they wrote and trying to understand a little bit about it. You're asking me? I'm not competent to tell you. I can tell you what other great physicists say about the debate because I've read what they say, but I'm not competent in that field. I'm not competent to have an opinion in that field. When people write about philosophy, since I'm a trained philosopher and I publish in philosophy myself, I have a right to an opinion because I studied it and I have a good degree of mastery of philosophy. Other things, I read what the experts write and I quote them. I don't have an opinion. How much do you have to have? I guess to have an opinion of your own that would be credible, you really have to be pretty much in control of the whole field. If you're not, then what you have to do is read what the experts say and simply fill your mind with what the experts say. And say, look, this expert says this says that, but I'm not in a position to make a judgment on my own. That's my policy across the board. When I talk about science, I'm always quoting some eminent scientist. I haven't got a right to an opinion in a field like that. And by the way, this applies to yourself as well. There are many people with the myth, okay, if it's economics or if it's sailboating or whatever, I understand, that's a technical field, they're experts and I'm not an expert. But I know about myself. Oh, no, you don't. Just spend a little time with a psychologist and you'll discover all the things that you don't know about yourself. People are not objective about themselves. People see themselves through a haze of hopes and fears and rationalizations and distortions and people often have to be acquainted with their own selves in ways that isn't open to them. So it's not even true that a person is automatically an expert in his own case. Yeah.
Why do we wear tzitzis? What's the reason behind that?
Okay, but we wear it because the Torah said to wear it, period, right? But if you want to know some of the symbolism behind it, people who have status in a government, this used to be universal. A person had status in a government had some visible thing that he wore to show that he had that status. The prime minister wore a medallion around his neck which said, I'm prime minister. It's a way of identifying him in terms of his function. We still have that today for the military. We have that for the judiciary. A judge sitting on the bench does not sit in his business suit, nor does he sit in a pair of slacks and a comfortable short-sleeve shirt. He sits in a long black robe because what he wears identifies his function. When you have a function that's an important function, then it's marked by a particular uniform. I used to perform classical music. I don't know how they do it today, but in my day, you wore formal black clothes. You didn't come in a sweatshirt and sweatpants because you're playing Beethoven. Playing Beethoven is important. It's important cultural value. That has to be expressed by the fact that you dress to fit the importance of the occasion. So the attitude about tzitzis and tefillin also is that these are insignia of being on the staff of the creator of the universe. These are visible insignia of the one whom you're serving. That's one standard understanding of the idea of tzitzis. And in that respect, it becomes extremely important, extremely essential.
So we already have people for that?
No, well, let's put it this way. Anything that identifies as a Jew will play that role in some degree. But the kippah plays a more mundane role. You wear clothes. You wear clothes because you are, otherwise your bare body is visible, and we don't do that. Now, typically the people who are looking at us from a level similar to our own. So if he's looking at me, my face and my body is covered. Suppose somebody's looking from on top. Then what he's going to see is the top of my head. Putting a head covering on is a reminder that there's another vision point from above, which God occupies. It's the idea of being clothed on the top as well, to remind myself that there's a vision point from above. Of course, God sees from all directions, doesn't see it all, but just knows. But in terms of experiencing it symbolically, that's the idea. Yira Malka, so Yamalka is a contraction of two words, which means having awe for the king, which is God. Yeah.
How do you have someone who actually proves God?
Well, first of all, I say you can't prove anything. So don't ask me to prove it. You're barking up the wrong tree. You prove to me who your parents are. Go ahead. Try. They told you and you trusted them. How quaint. You did a DNA test? Well, you didn't. I know you didn't. And if you did, how do you know those people didn't pay off the lab to lie to you about the results? You did the test yourself? No, you didn't. Give me a break. So then we say, well, if you can't prove it to your parents, you say, give it up? It's irrational to believe in it? No, you don't need proofs. Asking for a proof is just a way of protecting your cheeseburgers. Because I know you can't give a proof, so therefore I'll always eat cheeseburgers. Proof is not the right goal. The right goal is having adequate reason. Adequate reason means you survey the evidence, you assess what the evidence supports, you ask whether there are any other competing positions that are better supported by the evidence. And if there aren't, then it's reasonable to accept this as the correct position. That's, I think, the only reasonable approach. Now, I have a whole set of material in audio and written, and a large portion that's hopefully going to come out sometime in the near future, showing that the evidence supports the correctness of the Torah. It's not something that I can tell you in 2 minutes. By the way, someone who says, how do you prove God, usually has a time schedule of about 2.5 minutes. That's his attention span. It's in between the two halves of the television program. He was going to get a beer and he's stopping on the way to find out how you prove God so he can get back to the television program. That's hopeless. It's hopeless. A similar idea, which bears on other things as well. Somebody says, what's the cause of health? But I'm in a hurry. Give me the cause in 2 sentences. The right response is, I'm sorry, you're asking for an impossibility. The cause of health? There are a dozen causes of health. And they complement one another in various ways. And if you want a single 2-sentence answer, you're asking for an impossible response. Health is complicated. Health is complicated. How do you know there are molecules? 1 2-sentence answer. How do you know there are molecules? You can't answer that. First of all, because I'll bet no one in this room knows how we know there are molecules. And if you come to know it, you'll see that a 2-sentence answer isn't available. Not every question has a 2-sentence answer. If your attention span is that short, there's nothing we can do for you. And there are books that can be read, there are discussions that can be had, tapes that can be listened to. I've produced some of them, other people have produced others of them. And it'll have to work in 2 ways. One is to present the positive evidence supporting the Torah, and the other is to present the critique of the competing hypotheses which are presented by the non-religious world as if they were absolutely certain and established beyond a doubt. And when you examine them, which isn't popular, if you examine them, you'll see that there's a great deal of looseness and insubstantiality about the competing positions. But that's not a short investigation. I grew up in a non-religious household, and when I was in college, I decided to make an investigation. It took me 2 years. Okay, I wasn't as good at investigating then as I am today. But still, it took me 2 years of patient, difficult, strenuous study, back and forth, ups and downs, sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's not something that's going to come about in a short, compact discussion. Yeah.
A lot of philosophies, like this is going on the opinion thing that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
A lot of philosophies or like systems are based on axiomatic principles that can't necessarily be proven, but like there's evidence for them. So to have an opinion, like you don't need to necessarily have an opinion. Like for Judaism, if you don't agree with the premise, then you would be able to argue on the premise, but you wouldn't necessarily have to be knowledgeable in all what comes after to have an opinion on the premise, as long as you were able to argue within the premise, right? So if you didn't buy one of the basic principles, you wouldn't have to have a holistic approach of all of Talmud to argue against like one of the basic principles, like belief in God, the divine origin of the Torah.
I think that's right. I think it's right. Now, if I hold you to your vocabulary, you sort of waffled between if I could argue, that's one expression that you had, and the other is if I don't buy, but I don't buy is psychological, right? I'm not interested whether you buy it, you don't buy it. You might like your drugs better. I don't know why. Do you have reasons against it? Or do you have undercutting reasons that show that the reasons people show that are for it don't do the job? I agree with you. If depending upon what reasons are presented in favor of the existence of God, then you'll have to be familiar with that material and be able to handle it. You have to know everything about the Talmud in order to discuss whether there's a God. That is correct. That is certainly correct. But as far as that subject of whether there's a God and how it's argued, if somebody argues, for example, on the basis of Jewish survival through history, which is one of my arguments, you have to be pretty knowledgeable. Here's a little tricky question. Does Judaism survive? Look at the differences in the practice of Judaism over 1,000 or 2,000 years. You'll find quite substantial differences in practice. Does that mean Judaism survived or didn't survive? Did it significantly evolve or not? You may need to know whether the changes were built into the original laws or not. And law can say, under conditions A, do A star, and under conditions B, do B star. Then when you see the practice shifts from A star to B star, that may not be a religious change at all, because the original law said, under condition A, do A star, and under condition B, do B star. Without knowing the Talmudic background for the law and the way the law is discussed in the commentators, you won't know whether that counts as a religious change or not. So if the discussion of God's existence is based on survival of the Jewish people, which means the survival of the Jewish culture and religion, you may have to get into detail. So it's going to depend upon how this discussion is phrased. But it'll vary from case to case. I think that's right. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Okay.
In the different schools of Musar, is there any do you think there's any specific school felt that's best for today's generation?
I'll tell you, you're asking a chassid about Musar. it's a little out of my orbit. The Hasidim took a path that's different from the Musar school. So I can't speak with authority about Musar. I can tell you a little bit about what I've heard, and I can answer your question that way. But I'm saying up front that I'm not an expert on this subject. There are at least two different foci, ways that these movements focus on human beings, on Jews, on what they are, how they should think of themselves. One builds a human being up, the other tears the human being down. Both are designed to improve your dedication, your inspiration. Whether they succeed in doing that depends a lot on your psychology. I think it takes a very strong person to hear, you're so low, you'd have to reach up to touch bottom. You're really a disaster area. You got about 1% left. And if you don't do any more, that 1% is going to slip away and you're going to be a zero. So you better pick yourself up and do something. I suppose there are people like that, but I find that in our times, that's hard to imagine many people being inspired by that. The other is to say that you are a person with great talents, great abilities. You have a contribution to make to the world. And chaval, what a shame it would be to waste that talent, to waste all that potential. There's a sign which some people have in their homes. I know I'm somebody because God don't make junk. God don't make junk. That's right. As my wife says, if there's a responsibility of giving a certain amount of respect to all human beings, what is it that all human beings have that deserves respect? What is it? Intelligence? Not all are intelligent. Good baseball skills? Being handsome? You have a soul. You have a soul that's given to you by God. That deserves respect. Soul is special. Soul is godly. That deserves respect. So, when you talk about the foundation of how you look at yourself, the second school of Musar says to look at the person as having great talents, great abilities, great potential, and talk about the shame of wasting that potential. Now, I find in discussion that when you phrase a question or an idea in terms of how it applies to me, similar to what I said before, it's hard to get people to be objective. They're very defensive about themselves. It's sometimes useful to take the very same idea and phrase it about somebody else. So it's not about me. If somebody tells me I have great potential and I'd be ashamed to waste it, then I hear, I'm going to have to get out of bed early in the morning. No, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. I like sleeping till 9. But suppose I talk to you about the slums of Buenos Aires. And I tell you that there are people, kids grow up and mature in the slums of Buenos Aires who have the potential to be another Einstein or another Isaac Stern. Not only Jewish, right? Another Picasso. They have the potential to make great contributions to the world, but because they live in a slum, because they don't have economic resources, because they don't have good schooling, those talents are wasted. Isn't that a shame? Isn't that a shame? Most people, when it's not themselves that's being talked about, but the poor people in Buenos Aires will agree with you. Yes, such great talent, such great abilities going to waste. What a shame that is. Correct, it is a shame. Well, then guess what? It's a shame in my case too. It's a shame in your case too. If you have capabilities that aren't being developed, then it's a shame. It's wasted talent, it's wasted resource, wasted abilities. That's the attitude of the second school. You have great abilities, you have great talents, and if you invest in them, you'll be able to accomplish something great with them, with God's help, of course. And you don't know what you'll be able to accomplish. I must tell you, I grew up in a generation where all of us were more advanced than our parents. That was because of the great idealism of our parents. None of them went to college, and they all sent us to college. So we all learned things that had a much higher economic bracket. That was our whole generation. So we took it for granted that children are going to be greater than their parents. I started teaching university in the 70s, and then I came to yeshiva. I began to get students I asked them about their family, about their parents. What does your father do? What does your mother do? And then the students would often just throw in the comment, of course, I would never be able to do that. I thought, what? What do you mean? Why aren't you going to be greater than your parents? Just like your parents were greater than their parents. I mean, isn't it every generation will be greater than the previous generation? I guess not. Then I saw the horizons that people look up to crashing down. I could never do this, I could never do that. A boy or a girl is 23 telling me, I could never be that, I could never accomplish that. You're 23 years old? Your life expectancy is another 50 or 60 years. How do you know what you could do in 50 or 60 years? Their imaginations have been killed. I think that's a tragedy. I think that's a tragedy. When we went to university, you could do anything. You could do anything. You couldn't prove to me I had a limitation, so I didn't accept it. We'll see where it'll come out. That's a much healthier attitude because you don't minimize your aspirations and don't thereby sacrifice the talents that you have. Attitude is the greatness of man because God invested in him, because he's made in God's form. God invited him into a partnership in perfecting the world. That being the case, one has to look for ways to use the talents and gifts that he has. That, I think, is that's the school of Mussar that is more applicable, and that is much closer to the Hasidic point of view. Hasidic point of view, it stresses the positive, the uplifting, the hopeful, the joyous, and that's what I think this generation benefits from. Yeah.
And in the ability that you work at, it's important to assess your level and the next level. So particularly in regards to learning Talmud, how do you assess your current level and how do you decide how do you assess what the next level to go to?
I don't think you can do that because only someone who has a global picture of how the Talmud works can decide what the next level should be. And I don't know if it'll be the same for everybody. This yeshiva specializes in Talmud. I don't know how many simultaneous Talmud shiurim we have going on at the same time, 25, 30. The goal of it is that whenever a person outgrows the particular shiur that he's in, so then he can go up to the next shiur and progress at his own rate. Different shiurim had different emphases. Some emphasize logic, some emphasize translation, some emphasize reading skills, some emphasize breadth of information. All those abilities are necessary, and you can't get them all in one shiur, it's just too scattered. So different teachers have different things that they emphasize, and as you go up through the system, you get an input of this type and an input of that type. And that's all very valuable. The how to know, I think the only thing you can do is ask, here I am in this shiur, what's the next shiur up? And am I ready for the next shiur up? I think the ideal position to be in a shiur is around the middle. You want enough people there who are above you to push you, that you have to push and develop. You don't want to be at the bottom, because if you're at the bottom, there'll be too much you don't understand. The level will be much too high for you. And if you're close to the top, then it's probably time to move up. Even moving up is going to be hard, but it'll be challenging. Once you're close to the top, you have a tendency to coast, which is natural and normal, humanly. If you're getting everything first time round, and you're helping others, and you feel very, very good, that's the time to not feel so good and move up to the next, and get the maximum out of it.
What about being comfortable in the shiur and staying in one shiur and staying forever?
If there's no challenge, if you don't feel challenged by it, I don't think it's a good investment. Even if, and by the way, you can have Rebbes that you start out not feeling comfortable with, just because your style and his style are different. It's a maturing experience to learn how to deal with people who have different styles from your own. I'm saying this to you, I'm glad you're sitting down, and I hope this doesn't break your heart, but someday you're going to have to work for a living. That time will come. And when you work for a living, you'll have to deal with all sorts of people. And you may have a boss who doesn't operate the way you'd like to operate. And you have to deal with him. I had a colleague at Hopkins who got his doctorate at the University of Michigan. He was a year into writing his thesis. A thesis advisor had moved to another school. Someone else moved to take his place. So they assigned this guy to direct his thesis. The guy looked at all that he had written and said, it's wrong, it's no good, it's not adequate. You have to do all this and this over again. Cost him another year. That wasn't fair. Students already into a year of writing his thesis, The new advisor comes in, should just simply take up where the other ones took off. It's been structured by the previous three. What he did was utterly unfair. Now you have a choice. You could say, it's unfair, I'm not staying with such a system that's unfair, it's unjust. And then you don't get your doctorate. Or you say, it's unfair, and this is what I have to do to get the piece of paper. I'm going to stick it out because my goal is to get the piece of paper. You have to learn to do that. And one way you learn to do that is learning to adjust to different people's styles. People who are teaching here are experienced, and they are qualified, and they have something to teach. And if you learn to adjust to them and benefit from what they have to teach, and the university is no different. I took courses with top-notch researchers. Top-notch researchers typically are not very good teachers. So they say what they say, which is fragmented, and they'll sliding from side to side, and either you get it or you don't get it. And you either get onto their wavelength or you don't get onto their wavelength. They don't explain, in great detail. I had one seminar with this professor who was writing a book, which became a very famous book afterwards. And he used to just ask us questions and, deal with it on your own. And he had super sophisticated theories, and if you sort of intuited the way he was going, so you got a good grade. If you didn't, okay. But he was a top-notch researcher, so you have to learn to deal with people in that way. I don't think it's the ease or comfortable feeling you have with a professor, with a teacher, is not a reason to stay in this year. If it becomes non-challenging, if you don't sweat, if you don't come in some days and say, I went over it 3 times, but I still don't get it. I just don't get it. If that doesn't happen from time to time, you're in the wrong place. You need to go up. By the way, that's the truth. The truth is that it's that way because as you become more competent, when you become independent in learning, you push your level up on your own. And you say, okay, so now I'm going to try that commentator. I know that commentator is very difficult, but I'm going to try that commentator because I want to get into that. I became fluent in Talmud, and then I started to learn Tosfos. It was back to grade school. Tosfos is very hard. It's very hard. The language is very hard. The sequence of ideas is very hard. Okay, so it's like starting over again. I started over again. And it took me a couple of years to become reasonably fluent in Tosfos. There's still Tosfos in there hard. But reasonably fluent. The Melchamos by the Ramban is murder. Murder. He wrote it when he was young, and it was all the complexity, and you have to cup this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing. Why do you say that? It's quite difficult. Okay, it's meant to be challenging. I'll tell you a beautiful. When I was a kid, I read a lot of science fiction, and some of the science fiction stories were very sensitive. A science fiction story about a robot butler who was serving a concert pianist, cleaning up the house and making his food and so forth and so on. One night, in the middle of the night, the pianist wakes up to hear music coming from the piano. But there's nobody here but him and the butler. So he sneaks down, he sees the butler's playing the piano, this robot. And it's exquisite. It's exquisite. So he listens for a while, and then he comes in, he stops over and says, how did you learn to do that? I mean, how did you manage that? He says, well, look, it's very easy. I analyzed the amount of pressure, and I analyzed the time of the timbre of the, it's all mathematical, and I analyzed it, and I have exquisite flexibility built into my digits and so on and so on. So the pianist says, I'm going to take you on a world tour. I mean, this music is wonderful. And the butler says, no, I won't do that. So the pianist says, why not? He says, because it wasn't meant to be easy. Now, no robot could do that. That's just fiction. But there's a sense in which God put it into the world in such a way that it wasn't meant to be easy. Chumash is like that. The 5 books of Moses. It's not easy. It's not. The first 2 words in the Torah are grammatically inconsistent and require a whole story how to analyze them. The first Mishnah in Masechta Shabbos also starts in the middle of an issue, which with practical cases, with no explanation, and takes pages and pages explaining all the background of what's about. And one of the great Ger Rebbe said, the Chumash and the Tractate are teaching you something. Our books are study books. Study books. They're not primarily inspiration books and story books and love books and so on and so on. All that can be gotten after you study, but primarily they're books for study. The first gesture is study. It's meant to be a challenge. And in Talmud, the challenge is unending. As at every level you get to, it's a level beyond. That's what I've experienced anyway. Maybe there are many people at the very top don't have that anymore, but in my experience, that's the way it is. Yeah.
I want to during that study, I want to keep it from becoming too dry.
What can one do to keep it from becoming too dry? That is a good question. That's a good question. Now, of course, again, that's a psychological question. What's dry for one person might not be dry for another person. Some people find it useful to trace down what you're learning to the practical halacha. Okay, so what would I do about it in real life? Not every tractate lends itself to that easily, but many of them do. There are offshoots or there are things that are mentioned, and you look it up and say, okay, so tomorrow morning, what difference does that make? On Shabbos, what difference does that make? That's one thing that people do. In a way, you're asking the wrong person. I'm a logician. I love logic. I just love logic. So I'm studying and analyzing, going back and forth, the arguments, and to me, that's Gan Eden. What can you do to keep it from being too dry? Let's say you're studying a particular mitzvah or application of a particular mitzvah. There's a book called the Book of Education, which in Hebrew is Sefer Chinuch, goes through all 613 commandments and gives reasons for each one. Psychological reasons, historical reasons, ethical reasons for each one. You might take out that book and look at the mitzvahs that you're studying in the Torah and look at the reasons that he gives. That might give it a little bit more background that relates to something you can understand, something you can keep in your mind while you're doing the actual Talmudic study. But, it's a good question. Ask other people. I don't have much to say about it. Ask other people. It's a very good question. I don't know what else to say. Yeah.
How can I have free will if God knows nothing?
Okay. The Jewish tradition has two answers to that question. The direct answer is this. The question, because when you say knows, I take it you mean he knew beforehand. Okay. The question is based on an assumption. And once you identify that assumption and you realize that it doesn't have to be accepted, then the question, the answer comes out straight. Let me just articulate the question a little bit more. I'll show you where the assumption is. I'll show you how we can avoid the assumption, and the answer comes out straight. And by the way, I'm not making anything up. This goes back to Asad Gaon 1,100 years ago, and the Keres Yitzchak and the Chuvas Rivash. We have it in our sources. I'm making a decision. I have in front of me A and B. I'm considering pluses and minuses. Up to the last minute, I feel that I could do either A or B. And then at the last minute, I choose B. That's what I do. Now the critic says, do you agree that God already yesterday knew what you were going to do? Knew you were going to pick B? Yes. Well then, if God knew yesterday that you're going to pick B, wouldn't picking A today contradict God's knowledge yesterday? He knows I'm going to pick B. He knew yesterday I'm going to pick B, and I pick A. That's a clash. They can't both be right. But now, imagine you think it's possible for you to do A. Possible. That means it's possible for you to contradict God's knowledge yesterday. God's knowledge is perfect. God's knowledge is absolute. God's knowledge is infallible. Can't be wrong. So it can't be possible for you to do A. Then the critic says, well, so you see, it wasn't possible for you to do A. The only thing that was possible for you was to be that which God knew yesterday you were going to do. Then you didn't have a choice between two alternatives. And that's not free will. Free will is where you have two alternatives, both open, both possible for you, and your choice creates what you do. Here you didn't have two alternatives. God's knowledge yesterday cuts off the other alternative. That's the problem. Maimonides puts it that way, and modern philosophy puts it that way. Okay, now, the hidden assumption is this. I'm picturing God's knowledge yesterday, I'm going to do A, and I'm asking about my possibility of doing B. When I ask that and I assess that there's a contradiction, I'm assuming that God's knowledge yesterday that I'm going to do A is fixed, chiseled in stone, untouchable, done with, over and done with, because it's past. That's why the knowledge is put in the past, to indicate that it's fixed and done with. Then if I imagine the possibility of doing A, it's going to contradict the fact that yesterday I knew I was going to do B. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe it's my action that creates God's knowledge. Maybe it's my action that creates God's knowledge. So that when we ask, okay, God in fact knew you were going to do B. Could you have done A? Was A possible for you? Maybe the right attitude is to say this. Well, let's see. I'm considering now the possibility of doing something else. Of course, doing A would mean that yesterday he knew A, not B, but A, because he knows what I do. And my doing it is the source of his knowledge. So when I imagine the possibility of doing A, I'll have to revise what I say about yesterday. Then there's no inconsistency. Because I don't hold God's knowledge of B fixed, chiseled in stone. Here's an intuitive way to look at this, due to Bertrand Russell, 20th century's most famous atheist. He said, don't beat up the religious believer with this problem, because it has a simple solution. Imagine God yesterday looking at today. God sees today. He looks ahead. I know that's hard for you and me, but we're talking about God, right? Okay, so God yesterday observes today. He observes me doing B. That's how he knows yesterday that I do B today. He knows it because he observes me yesterday, peeks ahead one day. So now when you imagine the possibility of my doing A instead of B, of course, then God, peeking ahead from yesterday, will know that I do A, not B. Then there's no contradiction at all. The assumption that was made in creating the problem is the assumption that God's knowledge is chiseled in stone and independent of the action that the human being performs. That assumption is not necessary. And by the way, this shows that putting God's knowledge in the past isn't essential. That's not the essential idea. You put it in the past only to make a person think, well, since it's past, it's untouchable. It's something which can't be affected, so my free will today can't have any effect on it. But if, for example, like some people, some religious thinkers want to say, God can't be put in time, you can't talk about God yesterday, God is outside of time, that doesn't help. Putting God outside of time doesn't help. Because if God's knowledge outside of time is fixed, absolute, chiseled in stone, and immutable, then in that body of external knowledge, there's my doing B, and I do B, then I can't do A. Whether it's yesterday or tomorrow or out. If it's outside of time and not dependent upon my action, then I can't do B either. Putting it yesterday is not the issue. It's, by the way, the Tshuvas HaRivosh writes this, and I had this wrong for many, many years. When I read the Tshuvas HaRivosh, one of our great rabbinic thinkers, I realized that my analysis was inadequate. So that's the key to the answer. If you want to answer it directly, the problem is based on a hidden assumption, and the assumption is not necessary to accept. There are other approaches as well, but that's the direct answer. Yeah.
I read something in Charisma of Others. He's writing about tshuva, and he writes that if someone has forbidden sexual relations with a woman, and she gives birth to a mamzer, this person can never be forgiven and have an atonement until that mamzer dies. My question is, why would that be? His sin is the same whether he gives birth to a mamzer or not. And his sin is between him and God. He'll do tshuva and he repents and does whatever he's supposed to do. It should be independent of whether that mamzer survives or not.
Okay. Your logic is fine, but you didn't carry the logic out to the end. Because you make it sound as if whether or not a mamzer is born is just an accident. But you know that's not true. The mamzer is born is because God wants the mamzer to be born. And then God is saying, when the mamzer is born, that I don't want him to be forgiven until the mamzer dies. It's not as if the mamzer being born in itself creates a consequence that changes the moral status of what he did. We don't believe in the independent moral status of what he did. I'll give you another example. This example discussed in philosophy, and I found it interesting to take the example and transport it into our context. Something called moral luck. A takes aim at B with a weapon and fires a bullet. B gets hit and dies. Second case, A takes aim at B with a weapon, fires with perfectly accurate aim, and an unexpected breeze blows the bullet aside, and B is unharmed. What is the difference between A's crime and B, the first crime and the second crime? In terms of the evil of A, it's exactly the same. In both cases, he fired a gun to kill somebody. It's just an accident of the wind blowing. That the first time he dies, and the second time he doesn't die. That doesn't cast any difference on A's moral status. And here, in terms of the way philosophy discusses it, we have a clash of intuitions. On the one hand, looking at the person pulling the trigger, he's just as vicious, he's just as irresponsible, he's just as criminal, just as dangerous. The wind can't change my moral judgment about the guy who pulled the trigger. The wind is just an accident, an accidental happenstance of the environment. On the other hand, the one guy killed somebody. Second guy, it's attempted murder. And there's a feeling that, okay, but somebody didn't die. And there's a clash of intuitions, and it is very difficult to be articulate and clear and have a consistent way to deal with this clash of intuitions. In general philosophy, this is not really solved in a satisfactory way. Now, it's very interesting that you have problems in general philosophy, which, when you transpose them into our context, the problem doesn't exist. Our context is one that doesn't allow the problem to arise. I don't say that now in praise of our context, just a difference in the way the context works. In our case, the breeze blowing the bullet aside isn't an accident. It isn't an accident. The breeze blowing the bullet aside means God says, I don't want this person to have committed murder. Now, let's suppose there are witnesses, and let's suppose he's being warned to the Jewish law, and if he commits murder, he's going to be executed. So if the breeze blows it aside, God is causing that he won't be executed. And if the breeze doesn't blow it aside, then God is causing, because God causes the still air also, he's causing that he will be executed. So it's not up to us to figure out which is the bigger crime. The answer is divine providence decides that these are the consequences that he wants for this person and that person. Person commits a crime, there are no witnesses. So he's not going to be caught. God can arrange that there should be witnesses or shouldn't be witnesses. The witnesses are driving there, they get a flat tire. They don't make it. It's easy for God to arrange whether there'll be witnesses or not. So it's God arranging the consequences of what happens. And the same thing is true in your case. The question is not, why is the birth of the mamzer relevant to his guilt? The birth of the mamzer isn't an accident. And if the Chovos HaLevavos says, I don't know what its source is for it, but that the forgiveness or absolution doesn't take place till the mamzer dies, then God is deciding how long do I want it to be before this guy gets his forgiveness. And if he causes a mamzer to be born, he's saying, I don't want him to be forgiven until that takes place.
Why does that hinder his forgiveness?
Because God is saying, I don't want to forgive him until that happens. If I have a rule on the books that God revealed to me, he doesn't get forgiveness until the mamzer dies. Then I say, when God causes a mamzer to be born, God is saying, for whatever reasons, I don't want him to be forgiven until that later date. And if a mamzer isn't born, then I'm not holding him to that later date.
Is there some logic for him not to be forgiven as long as the mamzer survives?
I'm telling you, the mamzer here is just a means. It's not the end. It's not the explanation. Explanation is something about God's understanding of who the person is, what his future is, and what he's going to accomplish and not accomplish. Right? The mamzer is only a means by which God enforces his judgment that the forgiveness should take a longer time. It's not because it's a bigger crime. That's why I say the whole question doesn't transpose into our context. Once you admit divine providence, these questions don't transpose. Yeah, last question.
To join the two questions, you gave a very good answer about how God knowing what will happen doesn't affect our free will, but how do you reconcile God controlling what happens versus free will?
Okay, so that's you did that very well. There are really two different questions here. One question is knowledge. Knowledge can paint God as totally passive. He could be a passive external observer of the universe. He just happens to know what's going to happen tomorrow. That's enough to generate the problem of foreknowledge and free will. You're raising the problem with, in our terminology, of providence. God's running the world. He's making things happen. Maybe his making things happen crowds out our ability to do things on our own. Now, the short answer to that is, one of the things he makes happen is that we have the power of making decisions on our own. Right? The fact, don't confuse, the fact that God is all powerful is only a potentiality. Power is a potentiality. Being all powerful doesn't say anything about what you do. An all powerful being could, in principle, do nothing, just not exercise any of his power. God could make everything happen, but in order for us to have free will, he doesn't make everything happen. One of the things he makes happen is that we have the power of free will. That's not paradoxical at all. That's the way that we have to look at it. In quantum mechanics, there are things that happen that are not caused. There are no causes. Not that we're ignorant of the causes, there are no causes. That's the official position. Now, you take a neutron. If a neutron is free, not in a nucleus, it decays into a proton, an electron, and a neutrino. That takes a certain amount of time. How much time it takes is a matter of probability. So now, this neutron is happily existing comfortably in a nucleus, and I break the nucleus. I do it by bombarding it with particles. I break it up. Now the neutron is free. What's it going to do when it's free? Well, it's going to decay. How long is it going to take? Nothing causes this neutron to take a specific amount of time. There's only half-lives. Nothing that determines when it will go. So I have caused it to do something uncaused. By knocking it out of the nucleus, I make it subject to the probabilistic decay, and it decays when it decays spontaneously. So that's a model of A causing a situation where B does something spontaneously without A dictating it. That's something like the fact that God gives us the power of free will, and then we exercise the power of free will on our own.